We are in part 3 of caring for family, and we're in what might be one of the most critical sections of the Gospel of Matthew for the church family, to know how do we interact with each other, how do we treat each other. And it begins with Jesus speaking of the enchanted way of life, the life of the kingdom of God that perceives there is more to things in this life than what are right in front of my eyes. Jesus says that every child is born into the kingdom, and we can see that by default, children are born enchanted. They perceive that there's more to this world than what we see. They have imaginary friends because there's more than what's here. The stuffed animals are alive, all this stuff. They envision so much more than what we do as we grow into adults and life takes its toll. Jesus also speaks of adult children in the kingdom. These are adults who they're holding on to, or they're seeking to regain their childhood enchantment. They're growing smaller. But in their enchantment, these children and childlike adults, they're vulnerable. When you believe in big love, you grow to love big, but it opens you up to more hurt. When you see a bigger picture of things beyond this world, we can live smaller in this world. And it opens us up to people who want to live big in this world. Given their vulnerability, our vulnerability, as we seek to live humbly, Jesus says, be careful not to damage the enchantment of these kids, the real kids and the adult kids. But Jesus says it's inevitable that you will. You will hurt someone badly enough to fracture their enchanted world. And they will no longer be able to believe in me, a God who exists as love, and who in love and for love came down into the dirt as Jesus, God in the flesh, physically joining with humanity where God has always been, with us. In the Greek, it speaks here of not tripping someone up when they're vulnerable. But Jesus says that we will trip some people up. We will trip them up enough to cause them to stumble out of faith when we hurt them. Jesus also says, though, the way to mitigate hurting others and thus tripping them up and destroying their ability to keep faith in an intimate creator, the way you mitigate it is to work on what is tripping me up. I should work on what is hurting me because, as he said over the last weeks, hurt people will end up hurting others. So I address what is damaged in me. And in doing so, I become safer to those around me. I don't ever do it perfectly, but I become better. I become safer. This is Jesus' first step to caring for the family of humanity. You care for the vulnerable, the status of which all humanity starts out at, as children. And caring for the vulnerable around me starts with self-care. But as I'm still and will for the rest of my life, sadly be an imperfect person, I'm still going to trip people up. And I will possibly trip them right out of faith. So what do I do with those who I and others have caused to trip right out of their faith? And now they've wandered off. I and we are to aid the strays, the ones who've been tripped. In step 2 of caring for the family, Jesus moves his metaphor from kids to sheep. And Jesus speaks now of every human as sheep. And the kids who were caused to trip and fall out of faith are now sheep who've strayed from the flock. The Greek word for going astray relates to being deceived. And it even carries the notion of staggering. The Greek word here for astray is that I or someone else has treated someone, we'll call him Jimmy, I've treated Jimmy, or someone else has treated Jimmy in a manner that he is deceived into not believing there's a God who cares for him. And there is a love bigger than this world. Jimmy's deceived into believing that God cannot be true because Jimmy cannot see God through how he has been treated. So we get what Jesus is saying here. All humanity starts out as children in the kingdom, or with this new metaphor, they start out as sheep in the flock. Of those who leave down the road of life, they're a victim. They're either a child who's been tripped, or they're a sheep who's been deceived. So that all humanity is still a child or a sheep. The question is just, have they been victimized to the point of the destruction of their faith? So that now they lack a proper orientation. They're lost. We explored last week about these lost victims, that God as Father doesn't want them to stay lost. He doesn't want them to exist in a disenchanted reality. That all there is to life is simply the broken crap in this world. So in Luke, God enfleshed in Jesus, he's presented as a perfect shepherd who will search until the lost sheep are found. While in Matthew, he doesn't focus on the finding and the celebration, he focuses on the searching. And we're invited to join the search as well. Matthew starts off verse 10 saying, don't despise one of these little children or these little sheep that you see outside of your circle. The word despise, as we talked about last week, it means don't disregard them. Don't write them off. You aren't to write them off because they're still the same as you. They're still a sheep. They're still a child. They're the same as you, except that their faith has fallen victim to enough damage to finally be destroyed. We don't despise them. We go to them. And we seek to aid them in finding their way back. Remember, the step is aid the strays, not condemn the strays. Too many Christians today, they go out of their way to condemn the strays. Some of those Christians can occasionally be found over in the streets of Canasbourne, where you'll find them regularly on the street corners holding signs of condemnation. In interviews to Christians like this, they'll often say, well, the people are meant to read the verse. It's a warning of hellfire. It's a warning to them of, you are condemned. And they should feel fear and guilt, and then they should hopefully let them repent. This isn't how Jesus is saying we're just supposed to find these sheep and bring them back. The world has plenty of slinging of accusations and condemnation. So last week we saw that Jesus tells us how we are really to go seek and aid the strays. And it's there that we pick up today. First, I'll say again what I said last week. If the words against you are in your translation of the Bible here, it's not in every translation, but if the words against you are in the Bible here, I encourage you to either ignore them or cross them out. They are not in the older manuscripts, and they don't make sense here. We're not talking about when a spiritual brother or sister sins against me. We're talking about when I see any human being who's a stray sheep, who's had wrong done to them, and now they're deceived and they've staggered away from their faith, and now they're doing wrong, not just wronging me, doing just wrong. I see them just hurting their life because they're going against the grain of love. So it's not only limited to those who sin against me, this is limited to all who are lost and astray. Later, Peter will ask, well, what's to be done about the ones who hurt me? Do I get to treat them different? Because I will really want to. And we'll get to that. But for now, the qualification here doesn't apply. It's not in the oldest manuscript. So we actually have simply if your brother or sister sins. If you just see someone who you love like family You just see they've gone astray. Go and help them. And so a quick recap of where we ended last week is that this process of pointing out a fault of someone who is a stray sheep, this is for matters that I am convinced deal with lost faith. In context, this is someone who I say, yeah, they're lost. Their faith has been broken. This is not permission for me to go around to all of those in the faith, to all of those that I can't say, yeah, they're out of the faith. This is not permission for me to go around here in the church and say, hey, you sheep, your spots are different than mine, and start picking out where everybody else is wrong. Just because the other sheep's spots look different than mine, just because they're eating and relaxing in another area of the pasture than me, it doesn't mean that they are lost and have strayed from the flock. Under these words of Jesus, in order to go point out someone's flaw, it has to be someone who is outside the flock, who I can attest to, I believe they're lost. And then we have to have a brother or sister relationship of love with that person. This crosses off such things as handing out those old hellfire tracts to someone who I think is a lost sheep, but I've only known him for 3 minutes. This crosses off standing on a street corner in Tannersbourne, posting on Facebook, or any other place where we just stand there and anonymously, not in a family relationship, call out the fault of stray sheep. So in attempting to bring a stray sheep back and restore their faith, we're limited only to those with whom we have invested and earned a right to speak, because I've built a family relationship with them. I don't get to speak at someone who I have not invested love into. And as we saw last week, the test continues, the check boxes. We started with, are they really lost, or are they just different than me? Are we mutually established in a relationship of sibling love with one another? Have I actually gone out to them to see things from their perspective? Am I ready for the standard by which I'm going to approach and speak to them to be the standard that might be turned around and used on me? And are we alone? I've most often heard the last part as being for the sake of Jimmy, who I'm about to correct. Because the assumption at this point is that I'm right. And when I do this, I'm going to do it in private for Jimmy's sake, because when I tear open his information, I don't want to embarrass him. I want to love the guy. So often this is done for Jimmy's sake. But like I said last week, I believe that this last step is just as much, if not more so, for my sake or anyone else who is the corrector. It's so that I save myself embarrassment when I go to open my mouth and Jimmy proves me wrong. Jimmy proves that as I have attempted to judge him from the outside, I failed in a step or two. And when Jimmy enlightens me on their life, and I'm the one who stands corrected to my wrong, I've spared myself some shame in front of a bunch of people. But when I go to correct Jimmy, it could be that I'm right, and that my point is received, and Jimmy is enlightened, and Jimmy says, wow, you're right. I've been deceived from the truth, and I see now how I got tripped up on things. And I've been stumbling around out here. I see that now. I didn't have the right bearings. Thank you that out of sibling love that we share, you invested in me, so you had the right to help me. And then you came to me and helped me, and you put me back on track. Thank you. And a lost sheep has been regained. But now, What happens if I have gone through my checklist, I point out where they've gone off course and are doing wrong, and they dismiss me? It says, but if you're not listened to, if Jimmy doesn't accept what you're saying, take one or two others along with you next time, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. In dismissing me, what if Jimmy doesn't disprove any of the boxes I checked to make sure I was qualified to go talk to him? What if I open the conversation and Jimmy just blows me off? Even more, what if Jimmy says, yeah, you're right, I've left. I see no reason to go back. In fact, I've been too hurt to ever return. And so Jimmy doesn't come back. I can wonder just how far is my obligation of family love meant to go? How hard am I supposed to push? How hard am I meant to keep trying with Jimmy? Jesus says that if I really hold that family love relationship with Jimmy, I shouldn't give up just yet. Don't take the first response as the only response and the end response. Jesus says that I should go and find 1 or 2 more people to go back with me and talk to Jimmy again. Why? Well, what happens when I first pull in 1 or 2 others? And my first approach with Jimmy was a bust. Didn't work out. So what happens when I go grab 1 or 2 others? Well, first, I have to explain the situation to them. I have to tell them why I'm even pulling them in. So my entire checklist gets reviewed again. I'm the one under scrutiny again. So I can go grab Dave. And I can say, listen, Dave, here's what I'm seeing in Jimmy over there, and I care for him. And I went to Jimmy, and he just dismissed me. He laughed right in my face and asked, are you serious? And Jimmy just stormed out. This really needs to be dealt with because I care for him as a brother. Will you come with me? Dave gets a chance to say, Jay, come on, man. Of course he laughed at you and stormed off. I would be offended too if I was him. You say you love him like a brother, but I've seen otherwise. From outside the entire thing, I've seen here, here, and here. Where I think Jimmy might not appreciate you coming to him. I don't think you have that relationship. And as Dave reveals where I've failed to build sibling love with Jimmy, I can realize the error of my ways and stop the process. I can realize how Jimmy could have been too offended to even stick around and explain it himself. He's like, man, are you kidding me? And he just walks out. And I realized I had no place of family love to speak from with Jimmy. Or Dave acknowledges that there is a family love to speak of there. And he says, yeah, bro, I see how you might look at it this way. But there's more information you don't have. Jimmy filled me in on it, but he said that he didn't want to bother you with it because he knows you've been going through a lot. So Dave reveals facts to me that I didn't know looking from the outside. Because Jimmy was trying to care for me by not weighing me down when he sees what he perceives as all the weight of my life. So when I go to someone else, I have another chance to be stopped in wherever I'm mistaken. But however, let's say that I go grab Dave and he hears me out. And he says, yeah, that all sounds reasonable. So he agrees to go with me to talk to Jimmy because he agrees that if what I'm saying holds true, Jimmy might be lost. He might have been thrown off course. So Dave goes with me, not to pile on another voice to convince Jimmy of what he's doing wrong, but to increase the amount of love for both sides. Dave becomes a third party, conversations are so much different when you have a third party. The third party gets to love both sides, even if the other two sides don't feel that there's some love there. And in the meeting, maybe Jim responds, well, hey, Dave, I'm glad Jason brought you in because I tried to explain to him last time this, and this. And Dave listens to Jimmy's side, and Dave gets what I didn't get the first time Jimmy tried to talk to me. And Dave then turns to me as that third party, and Dave says, man, what you said sounded reasonable, but hearing from Jimmy, like, yeah, Jimmy's right. And so Dave takes Jimmy's side and lets me know you're in error, actually. Dave shows me the error of my ways where Jimmy couldn't. And as I'm corrected, I've still spared myself large-scale embarrassment. But maybe Dave and I go, and we speak to Jimmy, and Jimmy says, you know, Jason, when you first came to me, I didn't get it. But with the words and the perspective that Dave can bring to this, when Dave got added to this conversation, it clicked. I get it now. I see where I'm off. Let me recalibrate. And his faith is renewed. A single one of us isn't the end-all be-all. Many times bringing in another voice is the one that needs to be heard because they can somehow say things in a different way. But now we're faced with a question again. What happens if Jimmy doesn't listen to me and Dave? And what happens if at that point I still remain convinced that Jimmy's astray? Jesus says, don't feel released yet from the obligation of love that you feel for him. Jesus says, if that person refuses to listen to them, the two or three, now tell the situation to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So now at this point, I talk to the church, I talk to my local group of people who Jesus says, what identifies you is your love for each other. I now bring a full community of love into the situation. And the entire process of this is not to endeavor to see my condemnation of Jimmy's sin accepted by more and more people until Jimmy just will accept his guilt. The process is a growing into a crescendo of love. The entire church now gets to speak to Jimmy from a chorus of love. And again, before we ever talk to Jimmy as a church, I get examined again first. Under many eyes of scrutiny, who now have to hear me out because I have to explain again why I think Jimmy's off base. And someone may yet reveal the error of my perception, something Dave didn't even see. Perhaps someone other than myself or Dave, they might know further information that sheds light on this and reveals that I'm mistaken. But if my thoughts pass muster with the entire church, we talk to Jimmy again from love. And maybe Jimmy has said to the last two steps of this process, yeah, I left. I'm never going back to that pain. And me approaching him on my own was nice, but he's like, man, you're just one person. Not enough for me to face the whole. You can't overcome the pain that I experienced. And then when it's just Dave and me, in his pain, Jimmy felt like, is Dave the only other one who cares? I'm still not going back. The pain's too immense. It's nice to have one or two people reach out to me, but that's not enough to fix my view of the whole church. But when Jimmy's brought into a room full of people who love him, and each one gets a chance to show their love for Jimmy, Jimmy comes to remember, this is what my faith was all about, actually. Back before the pain. Back before the pain deceived me and it led me away. This is what it was about. I remember this now. An entire community of love. But maybe nothing comes from the meeting, from the church. The church has shown up in love to support me speaking to Jimmy, and Jimmy still dismisses my words. What then? If the church supports my concern enough to bring all their love to the table and back one more talk with Jimmy, and Jimmy still doesn't listen, we read, let Jimmy be to you singular, like a Gentile or a tax collector. If things get to level 3, many churches are led by their pastors to pick up the perceived issue, address the issue with Jimmy on level 3. And if Jimmy doesn't listen, most churches are told by their leadership, Jimmy is to us, plural. Jimmy is to us as a Gentile and a tax collector. And the church is ordered to cut Jimmy off from the lives of everyone in the church. Or else, if the church leadership hears that Dave is still over there having dinner with Jimmy after Jimmy's been cut off, the church is now going to discipline Dave. Dave, you're not cutting him off. And we said Jimmy's to be to us, like a Gentile. I have both friends and family who've gone through this authoritarian abuse. First, we need to realize Jesus speaks with a singular you. In the Greek, there can be a plural you. So if I'm talking to a group, I can say, hey, you. There is a Greek version, essentially, of y'all. There is a Greek plural you. This is not a plural you. This is singular. So who's the single person he's addressing? It's the you from the verse back a few steps who started the whole thing. Jesus says, Jay, listen, you stuck to your love. You stuck to your family love obligation when you perceived that Jimmy had wandered off. And maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. We're not dealing with Jimmy. Like Jesus said, I'm here to save you from you. What matters, Jesus says, is that I'm not here to force you to love. There's obviously a rift. You see now a distance between you and Jimmy. You don't see it, you don't perceive him in the same flock as you. I'm not going to force you to love him. Thank you for seeking to resolve it, though. You no longer need to carry the weight of family guilt. For Jimmy, leave things with Jimmy to me and Jimmy. You have fulfilled the duty of love, and you've been released. Jesus understands that love carries a weight of care with it. And as I'm learning from Jesus, I learned that if Jimmy's wandered off, believing that our loving Creator isn't a loving Creator anymore, and something has damaged him, I'm to realize that Jimmy's hurt. And out of love, I'm to the man, I don't want him to hurt. And there's a weight that I carry. And in caring for him, I feel internal pressure to help him. And I will wonder, how far am I supposed to carry this obligation that I feel to pull Jimmy back in? Luke says that Jesus will be the one who will bring the lost back. But Matthew records for us that we might be the ones who bring the lost back. He says, if you can. So if my work is a maybe, well, Jesus is perfect, but I'm jumping in and it's a maybe. How do I know when I can finally ease up on myself a little bit and say, maybe I got to leave this one to the perfect shepherd? Jesus has just shown me. Jesus says, carry the obligation of family love through these 3 steps. And then don't feel guilt anymore. If no resolution comes after step 3, you no longer need to carry a sense of the weight of Jimmy. Place that back into my hands. You're off the hook. Unspoken here is that everyone else gets to choose how they want to view Jimmy and what relationship they will hold with Jimmy. Jesus is only talking to the singular you who started the whole thing. So the first problem of how many churches enact the three-step process and in it communally. And it becomes the church against Jimmy. The first problem is that really, it's nobody against anybody. As Jesus has just done through Matthew, he saves me from me. He deals with me. And this process deals with what I perceive of where Jimmy's at, of what I perceive of a weight of love, and wondering how far do I need to carry this? And if nothing ever changes in my perspective for Jimmy through this whole process, if I end this process and Jimmy doesn't respond and I go, man, he's still lost. The process works on me to know that I have followed the duty Jesus has given me of love. And Jesus then says, this is good enough. At this point, ease your mind and leave Jimmy to me. As you hear the kids come back in a moment, we're going to go quickly to the second problem. The second problem is that Jesus never says to banish them or write them off and ignore them. Earlier, Jesus said the opposite. He said, don't do that. Don't despise or write them out of your life. So where does this actually end? Where does this process leave us? It ends with Jesus telling me to treat Jimmy like a Gentile or a tax collector. Well, who are the Gentiles and the tax collectors in the Gospel of Matthew? According to Jesus, they're the sick and the captive. They're the sick and the captive people who need loved and healed. They're the ones who I'm meant to love in a square one relationship. No expectations, just simple friendship, hanging out at dinner. To tell me to view Jimmy as a Gentile and a tax collector is not Jesus telling me to write Jimmy out of my life and not hang out with him anymore. It's saying, start fresh with your relationship with Jimmy. Go back to that baby relationship where you meet a Gentile or a tax collector and you don't have a lot in common, but you're starting from square one. Jesus says, go back to square one. This level one friendship, or we often call it an acquaintance. So I don't demand that the entire church write Jimmy off. If Dave goes to have dinner with Jimmy, even after this process has failed with me, maybe Dave and others still hold a family relationship with Jimmy that Jesus has said I've been released from. At the very least, as I'm to view Jimmy as a Gentile or a Pharisee, I should see hanging out with him as being like Jesus. Churches that write off Jimmy because they say we should view Jimmy after step 3 as a Gentile. No one is to hang out with him anymore. They're using the disciples' thinking when they viewed the Gentile Canaanite woman as someone who said, Jesus, please send her away. We don't want to hang out with the Gentiles. But churches do this. Jesus has shown us an entirely different meaning in mind when he shows us with the Canaanite woman what it really means to view someone as a Gentile and a tax collector. It means to ease off on expectations, ease off on everything, and just sit with them at dinner and love them. So where this ends, if the whole process is not successful, is Jesus just saying, ease your mind and go back to step 1 with Jimmy, which is just to love him. We'll see next week how these 3 steps are another point where Jesus changes something from the First Testament. Jesus butts up against the First Testament process of exclusion. There's a process in the First Testament, the law of excluding, that required 2 to 3 witnesses, and it was a legal process that led towards exclusion. Jesus turns it on its head by creating a 2 to 3 person process for reconciliation. For now, we come to communion. Through the 3-step process we're looking at, we see that there is no place where someone is despised or written off. There's no place where People are not always being sought for inclusion. If inclusion doesn't work as siblings, Jesus says, go back to square one and include them as Gentiles and tax collectors. Never does Jesus say, treat them as if they're dead. There's no writing anyone off. Either there's someone who I have a family relationship with, who I believe is a victim, or there are those who I have a basic Gentile tax collector relationship with. And I'm looking at them as sick and captive. The lost are always viewed here as a victim. They're deceived, they're tripped up. And at his crucifixion, that we mark with communion, Jesus lived the view of human victimhood to the end. Of his murderers, Jesus prayed for forgiveness for them because they didn't know what they were doing. You're victims. Jesus looks down at the perpetrators of his death, and he sees victims. He sees lost sheep who've been tripped up in a deception, so they don't know what they're doing. And God gave his body and blood, knowing where it would end, so that he could speak those words of forgiveness into our history.